I want to talk to you a little bit about how we're going to move from knowing there's a problem to how to change it. But in order to do that, I think we need to, first of all, have a deeper understanding of our own role, our participation in it, and how deep it goes in the psyche of the human race, and what has to be transformed or healed. So let me start by saying that the issue that I believe is central to understand is a struggle that has been going on really for several thousand years. So we can be forgiven if we haven't totally solved it immediately. The struggle is this. It's a struggle between two fundamentally different worldviews. And the one worldview, okay, this is on now, great. The one worldview says that human beings are fundamentally separate from each other and set in opposition to each other. That the way the world is constructed, each of us comes into the world by ourselves and we leave the world by ourselves. And the fundamental ontology of reality is that we are alone. And if by chance we happen to meet or connect with other people, fine, that's great. But the truth is that we're deeply alone, and that in that aloneness, we are surrounded by other people who are interested primarily in themselves and in maximizing their own advantage, in taking care of, looking out for number one. And that we ourselves, if we are to be rational beings, must also look out for number one and understand that unless we protect ourselves, others will seek to manipulate, to control, to dominate us. If that's the nature of reality, then the individual, who is a rational individual, is the rational maximizer of self-interest. The rational maximizer of self-interest. And in order to do that, in order to look out for number one, what you really have to do is to protect yourself from a very hostile world. And if you really want security, on an individual level, you've got to figure out how to get the advantage over the other. And if on a collective level, in a social order, in a society, you want to protect what's good in that society, then be sure that there are others out there who will want to take advantage and take over and control you, unless you do it first to them. And so the only way to achieve security really is through domination over the other. Now that worldview, which has become increasingly the common sense of the contemporary period, the dominant worldview of the contemporary period, of the last several hundred years in fact, was for a long time challenged by another worldview. And this other worldview said that human beings actually are fundamentally connected to each other, that we're connected to each other in a loving and caring way, and that it is possible to establish loving relationships with other human beings as the center and core reality. And that if that's the nature of reality, then the way that you achieve security for yourself and for your society is not from domination, but cooperation with the other. And that it is potentially possible then to have all the security you need, to have your fears about security dealt with by simply working out cooperative relations with the others. Now this second worldview has been the dominant worldview of the religious and spiritual traditions of the human race. It doesn't belong to any particular religion, but it has been a core vision of most of the spiritual and religious traditions of the human race. However, it has been in descendancy. It has not been in power it has not been the dominant view for a long time. And the reason for that is that the institutions created to sustain religious and spiritual practices became dominated by people who didn't believe their own message. Didn't believe their own message, and because they didn't believe their own message, they began to act in ways that made their institutions act in dominating and controlling ways towards others. So that if you looked at and studied, and this is true of virtually all the religious and spiritual traditions, I'm sure you can find some exceptions, but virtually all of them, had at their leadership level and at the top of their structures, they had a way of acting that really validated the opposite paradigm, the opposite worldview, because the people at the top were looking out for number one. The institutions were maximizing the wealth of that particular religious system, or the control over that others of that particular spiritual approach. And that vision of domination and control over others, that was the perspective of the first worldview, was actually being acted out by the people who said it didn't have to be that way. Do you see what I'm saying? And because of that, people began to lose faith in those traditions itself, and said, you know, if you really look at how people are acting in those spiritual religious traditions, they're acting so much out of domination and control. There's so much into that really that's all that really is. That's all that can really be. And if that's all that can really be, then for the rest of us, the only savvy way to be, the only reasonable way to be in the world is to assume that the other will take advantage of you unless you take advantage of them, that they will dominate you unless you dominate them. In other words, that the first worldview, the first view becomes the dominant view. And so even though many people still hold on to various religious and spiritual traditions, many of those traditions even today act as though the first worldview was the real worldview, the real truth. That is, they articulate a different language. They articulate the language of love, but they act the language of domination. And it has been this contradiction that has made so many of us go with that worldview and see that as the only way one can be in the world. And when one goes with that worldview, it becomes self-fulfilling, because other people, looking at how you're acting, seeing that you are acting from the assumption that they'll dominate you unless you dominate, unless you dominate them first, seeing that that's what everybody seems to believe, they come to believe that, well, they have no choice. In fact, most people on the planet are in that situation. That is, acting from the first set of assumptions, not because that's who they most deeply are, but rather because they don't believe they have any choice given their view that everyone else will act that way. Do you see what I'm saying? So it becomes a self-fulfilling circle. Now, however, it's not absolute. It's not absolute for the following reason, that most people have been born into families in which they had a very different early experience. Because the first experience that most people had was an experience of being taken care of and loved for their own sake by a mothering other, by some mothering other. And that first experience coincided with an early childhood experience of awe and wonder at the nature of the universe. So those two together, a kind of spiritual sense of the grandeur of creation, combined with a very strong loving experience in which the first thing that happens is that the only reason why we survive is because there's been some real loving energy directed to us. Leave aside all the neuroses of our parents and so forth. I'm going to leave that aside, because even though all that's true, it's also massively true that there was enough caring to protect us, and had there not been that caring, there would not have been, we would not have been able to survive. So in that situation, children have a kind of natural gravity towards, or gravitation towards, loving energy, caring energy, and a sense of wonder at the universe. And much of education is geared towards, consciously and unconsciously, towards trying to get kids out of that and to let them adjust to the real world, where the real world is the world presented to us by the first ideology, by the first worldview. That is, that it's a scary world. And that since our parents believe this to be true, as all parents do, because they live in this world in which people are rotating this piece of information from one to the other, constantly reassuring each other that it's really true that the world is this scary and hurtful way, that given that, the parents, in order to be loving towards their children, in order to really take care of their children, want their kids to learn what it's really like out there. And what it's really like out there is so dangerous because the other is going to take advantage of you if you don't take advantage of them first. And now I've got to get this kid who has this loving sense of the world and this awesome sense of the world. I got to get this kid to protect herself or himself so that she can survive in it. So the parents become the first conveyors of the reality principle, and then schools and the rest of the culture come massively into the children to try to get them down from this earlier perspective that they have, which would be a perspective that sustains a spiritual worldview, which sustains a worldview about the possibility of love, and instead help them grow up, become adults, be serious. Not waste time with childhood fantasies about the possibility of a world based on love. But it is never fully extinguished. It's never fully extinguished. The initial experience is never fully extinguished, and the inclination towards love, caring, and generosity is never fully extinguished. And I believe that if you want to understand the nature of social reality, that you have to understand that there are really in everyone two voices, two different voices going on at all times. One voice that is saying to you, saying and pulling you towards, I want to be a loving being. I want to be in a world of caring and generosity. And another voice that is saying, forget it, it's impossible. It's ridiculous, you're just going to get yourself hurt. Don't believe that, it's not really possible. And it's just going to, it's self-destructive to be in that place. So shut up that voice and get with reality and how the world really is. And so it's this alternation between these two different perceptions and that shapes our every interaction in the world. And I think that the way to understand it is to say that there's a continuum between hope and fear, and that where we are on that continuum at any given moment is partly a product of our childhood, particularities of our childhood experience, partly a result of our current experiences in the world, and partly a result of the ideological framework, the ideas that we have come to believe are true about the world, and put them all together and we come up with a take on what's possible, on how much love versus how much fear is possible, which we modulate from circumstance to circumstance, but which basically shapes how we interact. And that isn't static, it moves, it changes from moment to moment where exactly we are on that continuum between hope and fear. Now, this is also the critical way to understand what's going on in politics, in social reality, in the larger world. That is to say, instead of thinking left, right, think hope, fear. Because there is a movement of social energy, which is the sum total of an interaction of all of our individual energies. The movement of social energy tends to move either towards hope or towards fear. And if you want a criterion by which to understand or evaluate whatever you're hearing any speech, evaluate any piece of social legislation, evaluate any article in the newspaper, evaluate any movie, evaluate anything about the social reality that has social consequences. Always ask yourself the following question. Does this particular piece of legislation, speech, a book that I'm reading, movie, etc., does this contribute to the movement towards hope, or does it contribute to the movement of social energy towards fear? Do you see what I'm saying? Use that, and I think you will come to understand more deeply the fundamental struggle going on in the world today. Because this is, because insofar as the energy moves towards fear, then certain kinds of social policies seem to become obvious to people. If it seems like the energy is moving towards fear, then yeah, it does seem more plausible to go with that form of leadership that is talking about how do we get domination and control over the other more quickly before they get it over us. And conversely, to the extent that it moves towards hope, it becomes more obvious that it is possible that our social policies should move towards how do we build more institutions that foster cooperation and mutual caring. So it's the movement of hope or fear that then manifests in social policies. And if you want to change the social policies, you can't simply make the argument on the content level. Although content level arguments are good and important and valuable, but they also need to be made on the heart level, on the spiritual level, on the level on the psychological level, on all the levels that shape where the social energy is flowing, whether it's flowing towards hope or towards fear. And if you want to transform reality, then we need to build a social movement that can make that happen. And when that doesn't happen, then when you don't do that, then other forces will act in a way to move the social energy in one direction or another. I want to give a brief example of this, although it may not be totally brief to be able to tell you about it, but I want to tell you about the struggle in Israel-Palestine. Because many people talk about that as though this had come out of an eternal hatred between these two peoples, and that it was just a inevitable and sort of a part of the structure of the world, that some peoples are just irrational and they always hate each other. But the truth of the matter is that these peoples were not always hating each other, and in fact, as Consuelo mentioned, for a long time, particularly in Spain, Jews and Muslims coexisted in a very friendly and supportive way, and it was only the domination of Christians later, when Christians conquered all of Spain, that they introduced a real oppression of Jews and to some extent of Muslims as well. But for a long time, there was a great deal of cooperation there. It's not true that Jews and Muslims were always in conflict with each other. What is true, however, is that the experience of both the Jewish people and the Islamic people led them into this conflict, and I'll just say a few minutes about how that happened. On the one hand, you have Muslims with the experience of the Crusades. And the Crusades was this massive movement or attempt by Westerners, Western Europe, Western Christians, to dominate and control, okay? In the name of, remember, in the name of Jesus, in the name of a philosophy that claimed to be about love and caring, but in the name of that, an attempt to wipe out or dominate and control the Holy Land and to expand the West into that area. It had many economic as well as spiritual sources behind it, but nevertheless, it was this horrendous experience that the Muslim populations of those areas experienced, of these hordes coming for hundreds of years, actually, several different crusades. And it left a tremendous traumatic memory in the consciousness of people that the West was, when the Westerners came, they would be coming to do something to impose their religion and their way of life on us through violence and coercion. Now, so you have that in the memory of the Muslim peoples, and then you have the experience of Jews who were originally living in the Holy Land, who were thrown out as a result of Roman imperialism, and who then, as a result of the conquest of the Roman Empire by Christianity, the dominance, the rise of Christianity, the dominance of Christianity in the Roman Empire, starting with Constantine. And the Christians, for reasons that we could talk about later if you want to, having decided that they needed to attack the Jews because the Jews had been the group that had been fostered their Messiah, but unfortunately the Jews didn't accept him as the Messiah and actually said, no, he's just another one of our good teachers, but he's not, he's just like us. He's another one of us, which infuriated them, particularly in the first few hundred years after Jesus was dead, when Jews and Christians both competed for converts amongst the Roman population. So the story that was given out, that was written in the Gospels written 50 years or between 50 and 70 years, because they weren't all written at the same time, after the death of Jesus, and telling a story about, instead of talking about the role of Rome, focusing on the Jews as responsible for the murder of Jesus and for the crucifixion, and telling that story in ways that would reasonably make anybody angry at the Jews, but then building a whole religion around that particular moment, not around all the loving and caring in Jesus, and making that central, led to a teaching of hate against Jews, and the church itself establishing sets of legislation that prohibited Jews from living in any place except one little part of the town, that usually the slummiest part of the town. Number two, requiring Jews to wear distinctive identification as Jews. Number three, prohibiting Jews from participating in any of the guilds and in most of the forms of making a living, prohibiting Jews from owning land, and most significantly for Jews, every year at the time of Passover, which was the time of the Good Friday and Easter, the reading of this story followed by inflamed mobs that attacked Jewish ghettos, frequently murdering, raping, pillaging, and sometimes literally passing laws throwing all Jews out. That's what happened in 1492 in Spain, the expulsion of the entire Jewish population. In 1506 in Portugal. Before that, France had passed legislation to expel all Jews. Before that, England had passed legislation to expel all Jews. So Jews, faced with this reality, moving further and further towards Eastern Europe, the center become as a place to flee to as they're thrown out. In any event, having this horrendous experience, Jews then were very excited about the possibility of the French Revolution, the Western capitalist revolutions, which promised the possibility of equality under the law, that Jews would no longer be Jews under the law, that everybody would be equal under the law. We're very excited about that. But unfortunately, in the 19th century, as the dynamics of capitalist society played out in the 1800s, and it turned out that more and more of the ordinary citizens in these new states were finding themselves in conditions of oppression because the only jobs they could find were in factories that were paying barely survival wages. And by barely survival, I mean that the average age of death by 1850s in the industrial societies was around between 28 and 30, 30 years old. Try to get that. Okay, so that as a result of that, there were revolutions, 1848 revolution, 1871 revolution, and as these revolutions took place, the ruling elites of these countries said, hey, we got to figure out some way to get our masses to not be so upset at us because we don't need a revolution in our hands. And what they did was to turn to the masses and say, you know the problem? The real problem is the Jews. And to blame on the Jews the malfunctions of their society. So they developed in each of those European societies forms of nationalism that said, well, everything would be great amongst us English people, or amongst us Italians, or amongst us Germans, or amongst us French people, or amongst us Poles, except for the Jews. They're screwing things up, and they're the problem. And so a huge surge of anti-Semitism at the end of the 19th century, which leads to Jews put into a tragic and extremely difficult situation, not knowing what to do, in which many Jews thought, well, what I'll do is I'll try to, maybe if I could just be more like the Christians, so they won't hate us so much. And so some Jews took the assimilation strategy, get rid of the distinctive garb, cut off your beard, get a nose job, reduce your nose size, reduce your breast size, talk in a demure way so nobody will be offended. Whatever. Jews trying as best they could to assimilate, that was one strategy. But another strategy that many Jews adopted was to say, you know, it looks like this is a time of nation states, and the nation states are ganging up against us. What we need is a state like all other states, and we need to have a country like every other country, because all other peoples have these nation states. We need to have them. And so the development of a Zionist movement in which people are going back to their ancient homeland, saying, let's go there. Now, most Jews didn't choose that. Most Jews chose to come to the United States, where there was another option, because in the United States, the Jews didn't have to be the demeaned other of the society. Why? Because in the United States, unlike Europe, there already was a demeaned other, African Americans. See, so African Americans played the role in this society that Jews played for European society, of being the source upon which you could deflect all your anger and disappointment at what's going on. Just as, and this is historically happens in almost every class society, that the anger gets projected onto some demeaned other. Today, we're seeing some of the attempt at that being directed against gays and lesbians that used to go towards African Americans because part of the crisis in the society today is around the spiritual crisis that manifests in a crisis in family life, the dissolution of families, the dissolution of love. And instead of looking at the core values of the society and what is doing that, they blame it on the demeaned other, gays and lesbians. Anyway, it was the Jews who were in that position. And so some Jews chose to go back to our ancient homeland. And so here come these Jews from Europe into Palestine, into what was from the Arab lands from 1880 to, let's say, to 1930. And as they're coming, there's a great deal of resistance. And part of that resistance comes from the Arabs who are living there, who are seeing these people as coming there with the intent of hurting them, of taking over, of destroying them, of pushing them out. Now, from the standpoint, first of all, it wasn't crazy to look at the world that way, because this is the period of the high point of European colonialism. And in fact, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, the United States were in fact cutting up the world in this period. And particularly after the First World War, they cut up the Middle East and created these different states that had never existed before. Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Jordan, they hadn't existed. They were just created by the victors after the First World War, so that each of these colonial countries could have some influence there. So now the people living there, the Arabs living there, seeing the Jews coming in, instead of reaching out and saying, hey, why are you coming here? Is there some way we can make common cause? Is there some way that we can talk about our common set of interests? Instead, they say, no, these are Westerners coming. These are people coming from Europe. And they have a framework of understanding, a particular historical understanding, that leads to that world, to seeing the other as fundamentally dangerous. Now, conversely, put yourself in the position of the Jews who are coming. The Jews come there, and they are greeted with a great deal of hostility by the people who are living there already. And the hostility that they face is totally similar to, in their experience, with all of their history. So instead of asking themselves the question, why is it that people, when we come to this country where we haven't been before, why is it that people are responding to us in this negative and hurtful way? Is there some way we can reach out to them and speak to them and form common cause with them? I don't mean to say that either of those moves would have been easy, but I'm saying that why not try to do that, try to form some common bond? The Jews respond by saying, new, what's new? There's nothing surprising about this. The Goyim always hate us. The non-Jews are always against us. That every place we've gone for the past 2,000 years since they threw us out of our land, they've always been treating us in an irrational and hateful way. So what's so surprising that they come at us in this way with all this anger and hostility? That's precisely why we need a state of our own, why we need an army of our own, why we need protection of our own, because the non-Jews are always going to be against us. Now, each of these ways of thinking, okay, is a subspecies of the general worldview. The general worldview is the other is going to hurt you unless you hurt them. The other is going to take advantage of you unless you take advantage of them. The other is a danger. So from the start, the reason for this conflict is not intrinsic in the reality. It is intrinsic in the perception of the reality that both sides bring to the experience. And then, given their perception, they act in ways that tend to confirm the worst fantasies of the other. Do you see what I'm saying? And this is how it's been in every step along the way. I've just written a book called Healing Israel-Palestine. Unfortunately, it's not on sale here at the bookstore, but you can get it. You can get it online at any of the online places or at the Tikkun place online, www.tikkun.org. And in the book, I tell this story in detail about every step along the way, how at each point along the way, the other acted in ways that reinforced the worst fantasies of who they were in the eyes of the other. And so given the frame, given the certainty that that's what the other is about, you will always be able to find the evidence. There isn't a problem. Do you see what I'm saying? In other words, if you go with this framework into the world, you will find the evidence to prove that your framework was correct, because you are simultaneously creating the very reality. We have just done that in a massive way in Iraq. Okay? We said, Iraq is this country that is having a deal with Al-Qaeda and working with terrorism. Okay? There wasn't a shred of evidence for that. Once we had conquered Iraq and had our ability to find all the evidence because we were running the society, we ended up having to conclude, just like the weapons of mass destruction, so also the ties to Al-Qaeda never materialized. It wasn't there. It was a fantasy. But it was a fantasy which became true. Now Iraq is a center of terror. Now more and more of the very people that we said were running Iraq are inside Iraq engaged in terrorist struggles. In other words, you can create the very reality that you fear by acting on that worldview. So here, let me, I'm going to skip the whole story of Israel-Palestine except to bring us up to date. In the past few years, there has been this terrible struggle, the Intifada II going on, and while that was going on, there was also a group of people on each side, Israelis and Palestinians, who have been negotiating a peace accord. And the peace accord is called the Geneva Accord. This accord calls for dividing the land between the two, creating a Palestinian state, with almost all of the West Bank and Gaza, but taking some of the settlements closest to the border of Israel and including them in Israel in exchange for an equal amount of land that would go to Palestine from Israeli land. So 6% and 6%, an equal exchange. It also provides for funds to resettle Palestinian refugees and to compensate them not only for the land or property that they lost, but also for their refugeehood. And it also sets up a plan to share Jerusalem, to allow for Palestinians to have control over the Temple Mount and for the Israelis to have control over the wall at which we pray. And in many other respects, it's sort of predictable in the sense that it works out what any rational person would say was, yeah, this is a plausible way to share when you have two sides struggling over the same land. Here's a way to share the land in such a way that each side gets a reasonable amount for itself. So this Geneva Accord was signed by the negotiators. And the negotiators, by the way, were people who represented until 2001, they were the official negotiators who had been negotiating up till then for Israel and Palestine. But when Ariel Sharon was elected, he canceled the negotiations. These people continued to negotiate, but now as unofficial representatives, although they had actually represented the governments before when the governments had been committed to peace. And so representing Palestinian leadership and the peace movement leadership, and they've come up with this beautiful plan, this accord. Is it perfect? No, there are some problems, there are details, there are things that probably you'd want to change here and there, but basically, for the first time in the last, since the struggle began, you actually have major forces on both sides saying, yeah, we can work this out, and here are the terms. But the Sharon government is not going along with it. And because it's not going along with it, the United States government isn't going along with it. Now, why is that? Well, in both Israel and in Palestine, there are people who are absolutely determined to never allow there to be an agreement. That is, there are religious extremists in both camps, Islamic fundamentalists who say, we don't want any peace accord. We will do whatever we can to destroy a peace accord because we believe that the whole land should be ours. And similarly, there are people in the Jewish world who have that exact same perspective. The majority on both sides don't hold those perspectives, but the majority are scared. And why are they scared? They are scared in part because of the actions of the other, and in part because they view the actions of the other through a framework that says the other is fundamentally evil. The other is going to take advantage of us if we give them a chance. The other is going to dominate and control us unless we dominate and control them. And because of that, even though you have the agreement right in front of you that actually would give you what you want, both sides are frozen in fear because they can't get over the deeper truth that, and I put that in quotes, that deeper truth that is the common sense of the whole world. The common sense of the whole world being that, no, of course you can't trust the other. The other is going to dominate and control you. So if we had been getting this agreement in 1994, maybe. But 94 was a time when the energy was moving slightly more towards hope. Whereas in the beginning of the 21st century, the energy has been moving more towards fear. And when the energy is moving more towards fear, people buy the worldview that the other is fundamentally dangerous. And then, no matter what the other does, you can interpret it through the framework of the first worldview. And so I've read the accounts on both sides of people who are scared of this accord on both sides, and each one can tell you a detailed account of how this agreement really gives the other side everything and us nothing. And it's really amazing when you read from both sides how that is put forward. It's not about the facts. It's about the framework. It's about the framework. It's about the worldview. And so if you want to change the political world, you have to change the worldview. And that is so central to to every part of what we are going to do, of what we are facing in America. Let me give you one other example of this, okay? I'm saying about Israel-Palestine, which is one of the, I pick it because it's one of the things that makes people most despairing. If even the place where the three religions all have a stake together, and they can't get it together, and they end up fighting, then isn't that just how the world is? And the answer is no, that's not how the world is, but it's how the world is when you've given up, when the energy is flowing towards fear instead of hope. Let me give you another example of how that is played out in the elections that we've just seen in the Democratic Party. Last year, I was very encouraged. I think it was last year that Marianne Williamson played Dennis Kucinich's tape here. Was that here? It was very exciting. It was a wonderful moment to hear his vision. Now, what we then saw play out in the elections was, first of all, that almost nobody heard what Dennis Kucinich stood for. Now, why was that? Well, from almost the start of his campaign, the media said he's not going to win. He's not a viable candidate. So now this wasn't based on polls yet. This was simply based on their decision that, given the fact that he was going with his ideals in the way that he was, nobody would pay attention. Nobody would give him a chance. I spoke to many of the media people involved, and they said to me things like this: look, we're not against Kucinich or whatever. We're just trying to be realistic. And there are all these candidates, and we can't pay attention to all of them, so we want to be realistic. And they weren't evil people. They weren't people who were committed to a reactionary worldview. They were people who just shared this perspective that one has to be realistic in one's account of politics. And to be realistic means so now, what was the frame of their realism? Well, the frame of their realism was, look, this guy is challenging fundamentals about this social order. The social order is very powerful. Nobody's going to want to change the way we fundamentally live. So there's no point in giving him any attention because nobody will respond to him. There was a logic there if you accept the principle that where people are is where they're stuck, that they will remain there. So what happened is that most of the people who actually wanted something to change switched their energy towards Dean and said, okay, we're going to go with Dean. Now, was Dean the candidate that fully embodied what people believed in? Well, if you listen to the conversations that people had, there were a lot of personal imperfections and so forth. I'll leave that aside. But a lot of the conversation that I had and many other people had with those who were activists in the Dean campaign went something like this. Look, you're right, he's not as good as Kucinich, or he's not as good as this one or that one, but he can win. Okay, he's electable. And if he's electable, then we should go for him, because this is the best guy who is electable, and go for electability. So what happened? The media then, in the 2 months before the Iowa caucus, spent almost their entire time focusing on those aspects of his personality that made it seem unlikely that he'd be electable. And if you followed the polls that were taken by people coming out of the polling booths and the caucuses in Iowa and then the polling booths in New Hampshire, you will see that when asked what's the factor that made you vote for Kerry and not Dean, the overwhelming majority, it was something like 49% in New Hampshire, and I don't remember the exact thing it was in Iowa, said the primary reason is electability. He can win. Now you see, if you make a decision about who you're for on the basis of who resonates with your soul, who speaks the deepest truth for you, you're the perfect person to decide that. You see, you're really the absolute authority on who speaks to your soul. But if you're going to vote on the basis of who's electable, then you're not the absolute authority. On the contrary, you cede that authority to the media. Because what you're now doing is trying to make your decision on the basis of what you imagine other people will do. And on the basis of your perception of what others will do, you make your decision about how you are going to vote. Do you see what I'm saying? Okay, so then if you live in a historical moment in which the dominant worldview says that what the others will do is try to dominate and control, that they will respond, that the world is based on that worldview, that that's how things really are, and you've decided that the way you're going to enter political space is to enter political space not by saying, here's what I believe, but rather, here's what I believe others believe. Do you see what? Then, if that's how then you enter into that space, essentially affirming the very worldview that you originally started out wanting to undermine. Because you end up voting on the basis of your assumption that others will never be able to go for their highest vision of the world. They'll never be able to respond to it. So, but if you go that route, as the Dean people soon learned, when you're riding on top of that tiger, you often end up inside. Because then the media is able to say, oh, you thought that was realistic? No, that's not realistic. Let me tell you what's realistic, and they can make their reality realistic. Because insofar as the reality is being shaped by your decision about what others are thinking, the media is the perfect authority to tell you what everybody else is thinking. And everybody then correspondingly transforms themselves in accord with their assumptions about where everybody else is. Okay, so this is the danger that we face in the thinking that accepts, in the broadest sense, that accepts realism as the shaper of reality. We in the Jewish tradition say that God is the force of transformation, the force of healing and transformation in the world, the force that makes possible the transformation from that which is to that which ought to be. And that the world is not fixed, that the world can be transformed. If that's what God is, then what is idolatry? Idolatry is realism. That is, idolatry is believing that that which is all that can be. So our task is coming from the Jewish world. We say our task is to transform the world. And out of that came the decision to create Tikkun. Now, Tikkun is a Hebrew word that comes from the Kabbalistic tradition. And the Kabbalistic tradition puts forward this notion of Tikkun to mean to heal, repair, and transform. To transform reality. To make for that possibility of transformation. Now, can reality be transformed? Well, this again comes back to our initial frame about where you are, each of us, in the flow of energy. Because to the extent that the social reality has moved the energy towards fear, most of us begin to think, no, it can't really happen. The world can't really be healed and transformed. And if the world can't really be healed and transformed, then what I should do in my own individual life is, quote, be realistic. And that is, make accommodations to the way things are. So it's all very nice to be in this room with other good people, but everybody else is in this other place, and I have to make sure that I don't act as though this group is the reality. And wherever I go, I hear people saying something like this to me. They say, gee, what you say is terrific, but no, it's just us in the room who will get this. I think I told this last year when I was here, that the first got this when I gave a talk like this to people to a 400 Methodists in Kansas. And after standing ovation and loving it and loving it and loving it, they all came up to me and said, but it'll never work. Why? Well, It'll never work because, they told me, it's only Methodists in Kansas who could go for a different politics, a different worldview. When I go and speak about this in Los Angeles or San Francisco or New York or Washington or Boston, they say, you know, these are great ideas, but middle America? They'll never buy it. And the truth of the matter is that wherever we go, what we find is that the deepest commitment people have is to the view that it's only them and their friends who could possibly act from the standpoint of love, caring, and generosity, and that everyone else is committed to the opposite, is committed to the dominant ideology. But what's actually happening is this, that all of us have a part of us that wants to go for a world based on kindness and generosity and love, but that all of us have become so deeply imbued with the dominant ideology and its view about where the other is that we have, in a depressive internalization of that reality, come to believe that nothing else is possible, and that consequently we are alone and it's just a few of us, and that nobody else wants this. And because of that, tens of millions of people in America and billions of people on this planet find themselves depoliticized, despairing of getting involved in anything, thinking that the best thing they can do is to work out their own personal solution in their own personal lives, and sure that nothing really fundamental can happen. And because they feel that way, they project that into the world as reality. Everybody else looks and sees that that's the reality, and then they give up. So we've created an organization. We call it the Tikkun community. Tikkun community. The Tikkun community is an interfaith organization. It's co-chaired by Cornel West, who is professor of African American Studies at Princeton. It is co-chaired by Susanna Heschel, the daughter of the great Jewish theologian Abraham Joshua Heschel, and she is chair of Jewish Studies at Dartmouth, and by myself. And this organization, which we started after 9/11 2 years ago, is committed to what we call a new bottom line, a new vision of rationality. Today, the bottom line in our society is money and power. And institutions are defined as rational, productive, or efficient to the extent that they maximize money and power. And we say, fine, that's one dimension, but they should also be judged efficient, rational, and productive to the extent that they maximize our people's capacities to be loving and caring, to be ethically, spiritually, and ecologically sensitive, and to be capable of transcending the kind of narrow utilitarian attitude towards other human beings and towards the world, and instead responding to the world and other human beings with awe and wonder and radical amazement at the grandeur of creation. When you look at the world in that way, you realize that we are living in a world that is fundamentally irrational, unproductive, inefficient. It's our institutions. Now, don't get me wrong. It's our institution. It's not that I'm claiming that we don't have lots of loving and caring people around, but most of the loving and caring people around exist in institutions that push them in the opposite direction. And so we have lots of loving and caring people who are that despite the social, economic, and political institutions within which we live, not because of them. That is, and so most people will tell you that it takes tremendous courage for them to be that way. And what we're trying to do is to create a different kind of social reality, a social reality in which it would suddenly become in your interests to live according to your ideals, instead of it being a constant conflict between these two things. A new bottom line, a new definition of productivity, efficiency, and rationality. Now, how would you go about that? How would you start doing that? Well, it's not just an ideal. We're trying to build a social movement around it. And so, for example, we have put forward the idea of the Social Responsibility Amendment to the Constitution. The Social Responsibility Amendment to the Constitution says the following: any corporation with an income of more than $30 million a year would need to get a new corporate charter once every 10 years, which would only be granted to those corporations which can prove a history of social responsibility to a jury of ordinary citizens. Now, this is based on the understanding that instead of approaching these issues from the standpoint of, oh, there are all these evil people in corporations, we have the opposite view. We believe that most people in corporations are like everybody else, that is, like everybody in the room. They really have a part of them that wants to go for a world based on love, kindness, and generosity, but they have another part of them that is the realist part that tells them that's impossible. And in fact, in operating inside corporate structures, they have a fiduciary responsibility to their investors to maximize their investments, and that if they don't do that, they can literally, according to the laws of the country at the present moment, they can be sued for being irresponsible in the way that they're acting in relationship to their investors. So what we want to do is turn around to all of those incredibly wonderful people who are caught in a structure which is hurtful to them, but in a structure which doesn't allow them to be the good beings that they are, and say the following: they will, if the social responsibility amendment is passed, we believe that they will then face a situation in which they can turn to their investors and say, look, we have no choice but to be more socially responsible, even if that doesn't produce the highest possible rate of profit for you, because if we don't do that, we'll lose your investment entirely. So we have to be more socially responsible. And as a result of that structure, they then end up being able to do what they actually want to do anyway, which most people do want to do, which is to live in a more socially responsible way. Only now they would have social institutions that are on their side rather than social institutions that subvert their highest goal. Well, this is an example. It's an example of starting to restructure the society in ways that would take our spiritual idealism and make it concrete in the real world. Because we don't believe that it is only possible to come together in a church or a synagogue or a mosque or an ashram and say wonderful ideas. We believe that the task is to take the ideas from those spiritual sources of nurturance or from the Prophets Conference and other gatherings of this sort into daily life, to make that actually, to not just feel good on the weekends, but to transform the rest of the week. That's our task. That's the goal that we have. Now you might say, I don't know about the social responsibility amendment. Fine, you don't have to agree with it. To be part of the Tikkun community is only to agree with the goal, that the goal be a new bottom line of love and caring, that the goal be a new bottom line of generosity and kindness, that be the way we assess institutions and social practices, that we start to talk about these values not as something split off from our life, but as something that we really take seriously, So, for example, we are calling for the creation of, in each profession, of a group of people, and maybe you could be that in the profession that you're in, that would come together and ask themselves the following question: what would a new bottom line look like in my profession? What would it be like in my workplace if the bottom line were that we were not only looking for money and power, but we were also assessing ourselves, our productivity, our efficiency, our rationality, and who gets promotions based on how much love and caring has been generated here, how much generosity and kindness is generated here, how much of an ability to respond to the other as fundamentally deserving of love, rather than to respond to the other as somebody whom I have to get the advantage over before they get the advantage over me. So taking these ideas into each professional area is something that the Tikkun community is seeking to do, and we need your help. We need your help to make this happen, to make it real. We want to build groups of people all over the country who are engaged in this conversation, because this conversation is incredibly liberating. if you allow yourself to have this conversation, and there's only one rule that we impose, and that is when you have the conversation, you're not allowed to bring in the reality police. The reality police are all the voices in your head that say, there's some they who won't let us do this, right? Some they that won't let us do this. You're not allowed to have the reality police in the room. And just go with, what would it be like if you actually could build the world that you want? Because as I say, there are tens of millions of people who want that world, only they don't know you exist, and you don't know they exist, and you never will until you accept the Tikkun community's invitation to come out of the closet as spiritual beings, to affirm a different vision of a world based on love, caring, and generosity, and not just this, okay, to make that happen, and to... And not just at the ideal level, not just at the ideal level, not just at the, even at the clapping level. Hey folks, guess what? We have an organization we're building, okay? Okay, I want you to join it. I've brought some, okay? Now, try to imagine this, okay? I'm a rabbi, I'm a philosopher, I write books and so forth. You can't imagine what a drag it is for me to go around and try and get people to join an organization and pay dues and, you know, and come with us to our next activity, which I'm going to tell you in a moment, our next activity. But it's a drag because it feels like I'm back manipulating and trying to get people to do something they don't want to do. But on the other hand, when people actually do it and stand behind, not just by clapping, which sure, it's going to make me feel good if you clap, but that's not the point. The thing is, I didn't come here to feel good. I came here to build. I don't want fans. I want comrades. Do you see what I mean? I want people who will work with me, to make this happen, okay? Since we started, there are now 6,000 members who have joined the Tikkun community. And we are having our national conference in Washington, D.C., April 25th to 27th. Now, the conference is focused in part on a teach-in to Congress about the Geneva Accord and Middle East peace, and in part about this larger vision of social transformation and healing. And you can't imagine what a difference it makes to your elected representatives if you bother to show up, because there are so few people. The level of cynicism about our politics is so great that only people, basically only people who are very, very well organized into narrow self-interest causes bother to show up in Washington. Unfortunately, in regard to the Israel-Palestine issue, the right wing of the Jewish world has managed to intimidate many, many Jews who feel that Israel's best interest would be served by reconciliation with Palestine, and many, many Christians who recognize that not only Israel's but also the world's peace would be served by reconciliation with Israel and Palestine. They've been intimidated by the charge that if you dare to critique Ariel Sharon's government, you're an anti-Semite, or if you're Jewish, you're a self-hating Jew. Now, this has, I want to say to you, no, I understand why people respond to that, because in fact, the most sensitive Christians know something about this long history of anti-Semitism, and of course they don't want to be anti-Semitic. But I'm telling you, you're not doing any favor to the Jewish people by allowing that silence to happen on the side of those who recognize that reconciliation is necessary, so that the only voice Congress hears is the voice of those who believe that America should be 100% behind the right-wing government, which represents the right wing of the Jewish world, plus a strong evangelical voice of right-wing Christians who are both aligned behind Sharon government. So I'm here in part to ask you, join, but also please come to Washington with us, April 25th to 27th. Please meet with the Congress people. We'll set up the meetings for you. Please come. Please become active. In other words, take the energy from prophecy, okay, from a prophets conference in which we can, as somebody pointed out to me, you know, it's great to be, I feel very privileged to be in a room with so many wonderful people. Yes, it is terrific. But now take the beautiful energy that you have here and the beautiful energy that you have in your churches or your synagogues or whatever your spiritual practice is. take that energy and bring it into the political sphere. Help us manifest this in a public way. And that means join the Tikkun community, become part of this effort in Washington, D.C., and be part of building a new bottom line in society. This can actually happen, but it can't happen as long as we remain passive, as long as we remain certain that we are the only ones. You can give this talk, okay? I've said it in a very simple way. You can give this talk. You can make this, you can give this talk. You can convince people who are your friends. They will say to you, the first thing they'll say is, oh, come on, don't you know everybody's out for themselves? You then say it back to them, well, that's not true about me. I don't think it's true about you either, is it? Is that all you care about is your own self-interest? And 9 out of 10 of your friends will say, no, it's not true about me. One of your friends is certain to say, yes, it is, because they want to win the argument at all costs, right? But if they really are your friends, within a few weeks, they'll come back and they'll say to you, you know, I have to admit, it's really not true about me. It's just true about everyone else, okay? But this is the point. It's only true about everyone else because everyone else is certain that it's true about everyone else. And that cycle can be broken, and it can only be broken, it can't be broken by waiting for the next Martin Luther King or the next fabulous whatever. It can be broken only by you. It can be broken by you. We can do this together. Let's do it together. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. We're going to do Q&A. We're going to do Q&A for a little bit here. So is there a microphone down there or some way for people to, a roving mic or something like that? Oh, and I have these for people who would like to join. Unfortunately, I only have enough so that if you really want to join, take it. But to look it over, go to our website, www.tikkun.org. To make the plunge right now and say, yeah, I'm going to do this. I'm going to make this happen. I'm going to join this thing, okay? It's a sliding fee scale. We'll work it out. You get a free subscription also to Tikkun magazine when you join, and I'll pass around these. Can you pass them back? And here. Okay, just to people who really are serious. Okay. Yeah, I'll pass around maybe some more. Just if you've ever seen the magazine, if you haven't seen it, could somebody take it and just pass around a few copies so you see it's not like a little. Okay, questions, comments? Yeah, could we get rid of that light now, or? Fantastic, great. So the question back there, go. It's not on? I'll go back there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. And I am absolutely an idealist and don't believe in the word but. And I would like to ask you, I'd like to purchase the video that they're doing today, and at my own expense, I would like to make copies back in Arizona and pass it to many of my people in my community. Do I have your permission? I don't want to violate copyright.
I don't own the copyright, but from my standpoint, that's fine. You can also get copies we have at www.tikkun.org. We also have other talks similar to this that I've given, and you certainly have my permission. In fact, in the Healing Israel-Palestine book that you'll get, that members get when they join, you'll get it in the mail. In that book, at the end, I say the following: you are free not only to make copies of this and distribute it, but if there's a problem around, like, because in the Jewish world, there are people who are ready to say, oh, Michael Lerner, well, he's a self-hating Jew, okay? If you have that problem, just put your name on the book. I don't care. You know, in other words, you could make copies of it and say that you wrote it. It would be fine with me. I don't believe in private property and ideas. And I want you to, any of these ideas, take them and let them be your ideas. I don't need any credit for it, okay? So, yeah.
May I address that, Michael? What we encourage you. We do not copyright. We encourage you not only to share it, but get groups of people together, run off copies, both audio and video. Get them out there to as many people as you can. Forget this copyright business.
Great.
Hey, thank you very much, Rabbi. I want to say the campaign for Dennis Kucinich is not over yet, but I want to ask you, what do you think about his Department of Peace?
I thought Kucinich's idea of a Department of Peace was a wonderful idea, and I was very much behind it, very enthusiastic about it. And look, let's say Kerry wins. If Kerry wins, there's going to be a tremendous need to have a movement like ours out there pushing him towards being the highest part of his being. And this is something that, again, if you follow my analysis, it turns out that it's true about even when you get somebody fundamentally decent in office, they themselves still need to be pushed to go for their highest self versus their most fearful self. And some of you know, or some of you were here last year, I think I talked about this. I was, for a while, being described by the media as the guru of the Clinton White House, because Hillary had taken the ideas of what I called this philosophy at an earlier embodiment, the politics of meaning, to emphasize the fact that people hunger not only for money, they also hunger for meaning in their lives, for a framework of meaning and purpose. So she took these ideas and started articulating them as politics of meaning. And I got to know her, and let me say that they went very, very far away from what I was talking about. They did not embody it. But I had these conversations in which I would say, well, can't you go for what you really believe in? And she would say, no, we're scared. We're going to lose too much support. And I said, well, you're the president. Do you get it? You're the president of the United States. I said to Bill once on this thing, you're the president, don't you see? And the answer was, no, he didn't see. And what he said was, but there's nobody out there supporting us. Now, this is very bizarre, because probably if you had been told that at that time, you'd have said, well, we're there, we're ready to support. What do you mean there's nobody out there ready to support? But the perception that he had was the same, and that she had was the same perception that you have. And Hillary has gone very, very far towards a right-wing politics on many, many issues. And why? It's not because she's an evil person. She's not. She's a very fundamentally decent person. But she's scared. She doesn't have the backbone. She doesn't believe that there are other people out there. And that's how it is for most people. And it ends up being true, at least in my experience, with the people at the most powerful positions in the world, the president and first lady. And they were going through the exact same thing that people in this room were going through, of thinking, yeah, it's great ideas, but I don't know if anybody will buy it, and I can't do this by myself, and like that. That's why it's so very important for us to stand together in a public way, to take, even let's say you can't come to Washington, join the organization, because the very fact then gives an answer the next time somebody says, well, who's behind you? I can say, well, you're behind me. So it's not like I'm all there alone, okay? Anyway, yeah.
I'm going to join Tikkun, and I'm going to be in Washington with you in April.
Thank you. Fantastic.
But I need some help from you as well.
Yes.
Given the opportunity, I would have voted for Kucinich, obviously, or maybe not obviously, but I would have. The issue is the good souls who voted for Nader 4 years ago.
Who went to what?
The issue is how do you answer the question of those good souls who voted for Ralph Nader 4 years ago, and cost us, despite their good intentions, cost us everything. How do we deal with this?
Well, I think that there was a great deal of validity in trying to build a Nader movement, but I think that it was a terrible disaster that at the end, when it became clear that there were states in which his votes would have made a difference, that he didn't beg and implore his own voters to vote for Gore in those states. So do you see what I'm saying? In other words, in a state like California where it didn't matter, where the number of of Nader voters was still very tiny compared to the size of Gore's majority, it didn't matter that that there were Greens voting for Nader, and actually it was a good thing. But in states where it was really going to be, where it was obvious that there was going to be a close vote, then it mattered a lot, and there should have been at that moment a decision to say, in the short run, in this immediate situation, having articulated an alternative vision and gone as far as we could with that, when it comes down to the moment of power, yeah, we're going to vote for Gore. So that's what I think should have happened at that time, and I think that it was there was this. It looked to me, I don't know if it's true, it looked to me like there was some kind of blindness in Nader that he wasn't able to urge his voters to, in those states, to take a different path. Does that answer what you're? Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think that I'd say the same thing. I mean, I think that it's appropriate to have more than the two voices in an election. But on the other hand, at the end of the election, I think that I would, if I were to support Nader, I would only do it if he agreed to have a conference of all the people who supported him the week before the election, in which they could democratically decide for his candidacy whether he should, at that point, commit to getting people to vote, to himself drop out of those states where the vote is close in any way. So I don't think he's going to agree to that, and consequently, if he doesn't agree to that, I couldn't possibly support him, because I do believe that it's extremely important that there be a change in national leadership. Now I'm speaking myself personally here, because Tikkun is a not-for-profit organization that does not back candidates. So we are not endorsing any candidate for office. So just speaking, we're not allowed to. It's against our law, or against the law of the country for a nonprofit to take a stand on politics. Personally, I'm answering this just personally for myself and not for the Tikkun organization. Personally, I can't back Nader unless Nader commits to dropping out in any place where it would make a difference at the last moment, or at least allowing his supporters to make that decision at the last moment about in a democratic way.
On the first part of what he asked you, what I heard you saying was just opposite of what you said right before then, was that Nader should have dropped out and we shouldn't have continued to vote for him because Gore could have won. That really confused me, what you just said.
Okay.
Do you understand what I mean?
No.
You don't?
I don't, actually. I said Nader should have dropped out in 2000 of those states in which his presence would have made a difference, in which his presence would have affected the outcome of the election.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That's what doesn't make sense to me.
Why? In other
You're
words,
voting out of what you feel. It would be if I really felt like I wanted Nader and he really felt that. I mean, shouldn't I go with what I voted, what I want in my heart?
Yeah, I think you should in most cases, but there are moments in which, for a short run, you take a step back. As long as you do that without taking a step back from your worldview and your vision. In other words, it's possible to be an idealist and to be totally committed to your idealistic worldview and nevertheless say, in this immediate situation, I still am going to articulate my larger worldview, but I'm going to take an action which is less than what my larger worldview would call for, because in the immediate short-run circumstance, I can produce a step towards the better world that wouldn't be produced if I did the other.
Yeah, I'm going to have to think about that. But I'm not going to go for Nader now. That's
Okay,
for sure.
but do you understand what I'm saying?
Thanks.
So that is also, by the way, why I am supporting the Geneva Accord. The Geneva Accord is not my view of the world I want. Because the world I want, some people have said, well, why aren't you voting for a one-state solution in Israel? Get rid of both nationalities. I say I'm not for a one-state solution, I'm for a no-state solution. What I actually want is to eliminate these nation states and reconstruct the planet on such a basis that we would, the national entities would be built around ecological survival of the planet and not around the history of old national fights. Right. So, but I'm not going to demand that Kerry do that in order to get my vote. I'm not going to demand that Kerry either come out for the abolition of capitalism or the abolition of nation states. Now, and in order to get my vote, that's not going to be a condition, even though that's what I'm for. But I'm also not going to allow my participation in Kerry's campaign, let's say imagine that I did that, to be conditional on my not talking about what I really believe. So, yeah.
Wonderful message, Rabbi. I'd love to hear that in every synagogue and every church at services.
Amen.
Yes, I'm Jewish, and when I looked at your magazine, it seemed geared toward the Jewish person. And I'm wondering if you could stress how Tikkun would be an interfaith.
Yeah. Well, wait, are you looking at the same one I'm looking at? Yeah. The one that's, okay, are you looking at the one that says anyone but Bush? Is that the cat?
It looked to me like there was a lot about the Middle East in there.
Yeah, well, that was the Geneva Accord issue, right?
Yes.
That was, okay, that issue had a lot on the Geneva Accord, so it was, but let's get the other one. Does somebody have the other one in this, or did they walk out with it?
Well, you can see how I arrived at that conclusion.
Anyone but Bush, does anybody have that? The Bush one? Yeah. Oh, okay, so just, can you run one up here for a second so I can read the articles?
Rabbi?
Yeah.
What I'm concerned about is when we leave here, the image of the man with the yarmulke and the magazine about Israel, when we walk out of here, there might be some who say, well, I'll join something else because this looks like...
Because I'm not Jewish, and it's a Jewish organization.
It looks like a Jewish movement, so I'd like you to accent.
Well, I'm not going to take off my yarmulke in order to get people to join with me. I am at the point of believing that there are enough non-Jews in the world who would be willing to be in solidarity with Jews and in the same organization, and that it's not a condition that we pretend that we're not who we are. But the majority of the members of the Tikkun organization are not Jewish. Okay, so that's just the reality right now. The majority of our members are not Jewish. And I'll just read you some of the articles in this issue. Okay, there are anyone but Bush, and there are several articles. One by by Katrina Vanden Heuvel, who is the editor of The Nation magazine, who's writing in Tikkun. Douglas Rushkoff. Then The Passion of Jesus Christ, there's several articles on that. One by John Dominic Crossan, the leading New Testament scholar in the world, guaranteed not Jewish. James Carroll, a former Catholic priest, wrote the book called The Sword of Constantine, guaranteed not Jewish. Then Lama Surya Das, writing on creativity and spirituality, guaranteed not Jewish. Duncan Kennedy, writing an article on legal education and the reproduction of hierarchy. Then an article by Peter Gable on law and hierarchy. Then a review of a book on American Expressionism in art by a guy named Bram Dijkstra, guaranteed not Jewish. And there are a few Jews in here. There's an article on Anais Nin. Do you know who she is? guaranteed not Jewish. In other words, there's a lot of stuff in here that is not, it's not just for Jews, but it's also for Jews, and we can do it together. Yeah, I mean, I have trouble getting into synagogues these days, you know? I mean, they don't invite me often. To me, it's very sad that that has happened. But I have my own synagogue, and anybody who wants to come pray with us, you're very welcome. Yeah.
Rabbi Lerner, I'm a member of Tikkun.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Non-Jewish, mixed race, recovering Catholic, shamanic practitioner, married to a Southern Methodist. I'm covering all bases just because I think it's a good thing.
Sounds
but the
great.
reason I joined is because it does share my worldview and what you're teaching and what you're doing and what you're including, and I feel included in that, and I love the emails, although I can't read your prolific emails all the time. I do appreciate what you're doing, and I'd like to share that with everybody tonight.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We have time for about 2 more questions. Who do we have? Over here? Excuse me. No, here.
Hi. Yeah.
My synagogue is in the Noe Valley section of San Francisco. And we have a big Passover Seder, the second night of Passover, which is, I think, the 5th of April. You can find out the information on our website. You're welcome to come. And high holidays and whatever. Come on up. Bring your friends. Yes.
A few years ago, or about 3 elections back, I think, my husband and I happened to catch on TV the convention of the Natural Law Party, and I got so excited because their beliefs and the things they wanted to do aligned with the things that I've been supporting with the Prophets Conference as well. And I just wonder, do you know about their party, and what do you think about what they do say?
I do know a little bit about the party, and what I know is all good. There are a lot of really good people there, and I'm for them. I wish there was more willingness to critique the globalization of capital there. I think that there isn't enough of an economic program in them that makes sense to me. But I think a lot of what they do stand for is very, very good. It seems like they come out of a particular meditation tradition what is it? Transcendental meditation, which also I have a lot of respect for. But it's not the only approach to meditation, and I think that they are slightly overly excited about the scientific validation of transcendental meditation, and talk about it in a way that it may be slightly sectarian, but still, I affirm that they seem like a good group to me, and I'm happy that they're doing what they're doing.
One last question.
Hello.
Hi.
I really like what I heard, and I wonder whether there are any plans for it to go to the UK?
Yes, and in fact, I hope that you'll bring some, if you're there, I hope you'll bring some people to the Prophets Conference there where I'm going to speak, and maybe we could get together at the Prophets Conference at Oxford, and see if we can build some grouping there, because there are a number of people there that I know who are excited about it, and I'd love to be able to get together.
Rob, do you have the list for Oxford? List for Oxford, please. I'd like to tell you a little bit more about that since Michael's talking about it. We have Nobel. There we go. Vandana Shiva. Vandana Shiva is doing marvelous work. She's a physicist. She lives in India, and their whole thing is to start saving water water rights, and she's a heavy environmentalist. Helen Caldicott. Dr. Helen Caldicott is working to stop the proliferation of nuclear armaments. Peter Russell. Peter is bringing consciousness into science, and he's a wonderful man. William Bloom. Dr. William Bloom is a healer, and he has been doing groundbreaking work in healing. Satish Kumar, and in fact, I think Paul was talking about Satish yesterday. Satish is also a very avant-garde, out on the edge environmentalist. He's with the Schumacher Foundation. Irvin Laszlo, head of the Club of Budapest. The Club of Budapest includes people like the Dalai Lama, Bishop Tutu, many of the great leaders. Tom Hartman will be there, along with Rabbi Michael Lerner, Alberto Violdo, who will be here with us tomorrow, who is bringing shamanism, and Christopher Hansard, who is teaching us the healing of the Tibetans. And Paul Hannum, which you heard yesterday. Paul is with Oxford University. They'll all be joining Rabbi Michael Lerner in Oxford, and we would appreciate. Oh, this is also in association with the Club of Budapest. This is being presented in association, and these are some of the people that are working on this planet to change the ethics, of everyone, of all the governments and all of the nonsense that's going on in this planet. Thank you, Rabbi Michael Lerner.